You have studied and written about these authoritarian regimes, the Eastern European ones that we think of, and also the expansive nature of authoritarianism elsewhere. Give me a state of the state on where we are now in America.
Oh, God. I mean, a lot of my worst fears and my worst suspicions about both what Trump was going to do upon reinstallation and also the lack of institutional barriers have come true. I read recently that one of these NGOs that used to exist in America that basically went out of business once Trump came back in, that measure authoritarianism on a sliding scale, has put us at the level of, I don't know, I think we're somewhere near Kyrgyzstan, a semi-authoritarian state, obviously not completely consolidated, or we wouldn't be having this conversation, but certainly quite a fast fall. The thing is, I feel like this had basically already happened in the first term and just wasn't kind of visible to people at that time. And then afterwards, they were under this illusion, that Biden and his administration were quietly, secretly fixing things instead of, building the infrastructure for Trump to try to attempt to go full authoritarianism with things like ICE and cop cities and, a police state system. Now I think it feels to people that it's happened very quickly. But it really, it hasn't in terms of its creation, only in terms of the way it's directly impacting everyday life now.
Yeah, I don't know if it was Mark Twain who said it, when he lost all his money, how did it happen? And he said, it happens very slowly and then all at once,
Yeah, same thing.
Right. It reminds me of that. And I'm going to get to Epstein in a second, because you've also written so much and predicted so much about what we're seeing now with Epstein. But I think it's particularly instructive because of kind of what you're talking about, that the powerful protect the powerful. And we've seen that then across administrations. So the very institutions of government that you thought would bring someone who actually worked to undermine government, overthrow the United States election system on January 6th and beyond. I mean, as January 6th was preceded by the fake electors and the legislative crap that was just to gum up the system. Just tell them that there's an investigation and problems and I'll do the rest type thing. Even the Supreme Court, it was suggested, was going to be, and they were going to be in an alliance with that effort. What we've seen, as you said, is that there just is an effort to move along and get along and protect him in such a way as to now ensure his rise to power. So it's hard for me to imagine that this guy is going to give up any power. And I'm wondering, even as you read the tea leaves of the Supreme Court decision that came down just a couple of days ago, which kind of wrestles power from him, right? It was a power grab that he was involved in with tariffs. Now the power's back, it would seem a bit, it's suggested with Congress, but still he goes for the 10 to 15% imposition of import taxes. Speak to me about where the kind of the power swing sits with Trump, because I don't see him and I don't see the GOP giving up power.
Yeah, I mean, Trump is not going to give up power. Trump had no intention of giving up power. I think that, the 2021, attempted coup was beneficial to him. It became his lost cause, like the Confederacy was. It allowed him to build a cult, move political culture to the right, while people were suffering under the illusion that the DOJ was actually going to do anything about the blatant criminality that had taken place during his term. And let me be clear, like, this is not just Trump. Trump, in some respects, is an unimportant figure. He is a front man for a much larger criminal network, for numerous overlapping criminal networks. We have techno-fascists. We have people like, the Heritage Foundation and other right-wing Republican groups who've had goals since, the Reagan era of destroying the federal government. We have white supremacists. And also hostile foreign nations, whether they, are outright our enemy like Russia or pretend to be our friend like Israel, that also want to benefit from the demise of the United States. And they are all working directly with members of the Trump administration and quite a lot of them have a large blackmail trove, because of Epstein, because of espionage and the lack of national security during, both of his terms, the way he trades secrets. He doesn't think of this as, American information. This is his private information to make deals with, financial trades and so forth. We're in so much trouble that I actually kind of forgot the question that you asked me.
No, you answered the question kind of right away when you said, I don't think he's going to be giving up power, which is really where I started.
But he's going to die, though. I mean, it's happening. Like, the guy is almost 80. And that was the point I wanted to make. That's why I really hope people focus on who is trying to take power after. There's the possibility, usually in an authoritarian regime, when the leader dies, there's a power struggle when there's no clear successor. So often it goes to the son of the dictator. I don't think that's going to be the case here, but I do think Jared Kushner is a very dangerous figure. He's involved in a lot of foreign operations at the moment, including in Ukraine, in Israel. He's acting as a member of the administration, even though he is not. He's involved in numerous criminal and illicit activity going back decades. He's someone to watch. Stephen Miller is another person to watch, managing a lot of the worst domestic policies, ghostwriting Trump's tweets, including the one you mentioned today about the Supreme Court that absolutely was not written by Trump and was, one of the worst Trump, mimicry that I've ever seen. I mean, it was a really bad attempt. So, it's another reason to fire Stephen Miller. So Trump, if you're listening, but the networks are important, and the oligarchs, I think, are the most important people to look at, especially in the field of technology, because there's such technological dependency in the United States that it's difficult to compare our situation to any previous dictatorship. They did not have this kind of panopticon. They did not have this level of surveillance. Even you and I having this conversation, it's dependent on technology that they could just take away, manipulate, change our voices, make AI versions of us praising dear leader. They can do all sorts of stuff. And that is something that they do think about doing. So that's something to watch out for.
This is another level. You're so right to make this distinction and to have us focus on it, because, you have even on the superficial level, you have sort of the Peter Thiel installed vice president. You have a encircling of the White House by all of these this billionaire boys club that comes out of technology. But I love that in addition to the oligarchical structure there, that you've tied it to that technology can have a real impact, and we've already seen it. They've redone the algorithm on TikTok as the Ellisons have taken over. The idea that these major media companies that are also taken over by the Ellisons, CBS, Paramount, et cetera, that they now have, pre-capitulated in the case of Colbert, et cetera, and they want a shot at Warner Brothers, right? They need, and the reason that's so relevant is because, once again, this is a major media company, and that's where information and propaganda can be disseminated. So you've got all of this stuff working, and as you say, it's in control of a handful of very powerful men.
Yeah, and they tend to have, certain issues that are very dear to their heart. One is, banning any speech about Palestinian rights. That was one of the main reasons that they sought to take TikTok. They outright said this, that they said, Gen Z is learning too much about the truth. We have to cover it up. I was like, wow, you're taking the mask off there. Epstein, another one impacting, every regime, every Western country, royalty, tech, U.S. government. And they did not want that story out for decades. It's a weird thing for me, having written 2 books about Trump and Epstein, They Knew and Hiding in Plain Sight, that were low-key censored, despite being, bestsellers, but through word of mouth, but they weren't allowed to be printed. I had journalists from numerous organizations flat out tell me that their CEO saw, there was going to be reviews or interviews with me, and they were like, absolutely not. You can't have that Epstein book in there. You got to get rid of that. There's even an attempt attempt by my own publisher to try to take hiding in plain sight out of print, when Trump became the candidate and it started selling, really well. And, that scared the hell out of me. That also kind of gave me an indication he had it in the bag. But anyway, this is not about
Yeah.
me, but my point is that this was a motivator in taking control of these networks. And another one, I think, is controlling information about political protests, because from 2010 onward, we heard about protests around the world, the Arab Spring, then Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, all the anti-Trump protests, all this stuff. Now we're hearing about ICE. Now there is a large, not just anti-Trump, pro-freedom political movement, anti-ICE political movement. They do not want Americans to understand how many people share their disgust and their fear and their loathing for what ICE is doing and for what other repressive political forces are doing. So they're trying to control information on that. And, I think that is their method, both to silence people in real life on the street, but then to cover the evidence or just suppress it via algorithm entirely.
Yeah. And it's funny, none of these policies are popular. I mean,
No.
the one, and just as a digression, the one thing I would ask you is, it seems as though a lot of, I'll use Hitler as an example. I understand, and no one wants to mention the H word, but
I think the guy who made the Godwin rule, right? Like, don't bring up Hitler, was like, you can bring up Hitler now about
okay,
5 or 6 years ago. So.
Now that I've been greenlit on it, let me then ask you. But the one thing about him, again, this isn't about the atrocities. I mean, they live in a place of their own, but his popularity, he was popular for a time. And the rise to power of some of these despots and authoritarians, it seems, Sarah, and you write about this, it does have sometimes a popular movement associated with it. Trump doesn't have that. He has a cultish movement associated with him now, but he is not polling at a popular level.
Yeah, he really has never been a popular president. He was a popular campaigner for a while, the first time around, in 2016. That was genuine popularity, although the more he talked, especially when old videos and things were revealed and people began to understand this is not the guy from The Apprentice, that is an act, that is a character he created, his popularity already began to go down when the pundits finally stopped denying what he was and pretending he was going to pivot, and began treating him more as a proto-dictator or a crime lord, which, most Americans had already figured out. It went down again. I think it goes up and down. He's good at spin. He's good at propaganda. He often could, turn things his way. I think there's also incredible widespread hatred of his, enemies, like, of the Democratic Party, he pretends he's fighting these big oligarchs, these big billionaires. Obviously, he's not. He's a product of them. He's their contemporary. He's always been their backer. He pretends he's fighting corrupt people in the FBI and the CIA. Same thing. How do you think he got in there? This is a guy who would fail every clearance test on earth, yet somehow he's allowed to run for president, not just the 3 times people talk about, but previously, in 2012, in 1988, he flirted with it in 1996. Again, this is a known mafia associate, and all of our institutions that are supposed to watch that decided to look the other way. So this is the ultimate insider, portraying himself as an outsider. But because the media really wouldn't touch on that so much, they kept, putting him as this rogue kind of demagogue, and that's not what he was. Folks fell for it. I live in a state that voted for him, and they really thought, yeah, he's going to tear down this corrupt system. He's going to put something new and something more fair. How one falls to that the second time around, after living through the first term, I have some questions about that, but, I have some questions about the election in general. But yeah, as I said, I live in a state that he won. Everyone refers to my state as, oh, they love him so much. Nobody cares. They hate everybody. That's kind of like the commonality of Missouri, is just like everyone is awful. Get us new people. They've all betrayed us. They've all let us down. I am voting for the lesser evil, but by God, are they evil? Like, these people are all going to hell. And that's just sort of conventional wisdom. And I meet people who, most people don't identify as a party, but they'll say, yeah, I voted for Trump, and I hated every minute of it, but I couldn't vote for, fill in the blank, Kamala, Hillary, whoever. and vice versa. And so it's a lot of unhappy folks. And so this idea that he's got some big popularity, movement behind him. No, he has a bunch of billionaires behind him who don't believe in rule of law, who believe in rule by money and by force and by threat, and who are in their organized crime. That's his great card. And honestly, it's a very, very powerful card to play.
Yeah. It's interesting that in Sarah's writings, Missouri, where she lives, takes sort of a center stage. And it's a great character, if you will, in the story, because there is, people are hip deep in corruption of all sorts. And historically, it's been this critical state where a lot of bad stuff has gone down. I mean, alongside a lot of other stuff, but it's illustrative of so much. And so when you talk about the billionaires, the oligarchical class, there's a weird thing that's happened, and I was thinking of it as you're talking about Kushner, and it is, we have a lot of people in charge of very important things in government who aren't really officially in government. Kushner's not officially in government. The guy who runs the Department of Homeland Security, the person who runs it is not Kristi Noem. It is Corey Lewandowski. I've made this point repeatedly on this show. When you need something done at DHS, you go to Corey Lewandowski. You don't go to Kristi Noem. She's putting on hats. She's on TV. She's a good talker until she talks herself into or out of a job. But this is a bizarre fact of this administration, that you have people who aren't officially in government running stuff that is so critical.
Yeah, and it's incredibly common in mafia states. This is how they operate. They get their front men, and a Trump cabinet, they don't hire people, they cast them. Like, even the ones that were qualified, I always thought got in accidentally. Like when Mattis was in as Secretary of Defense, I thought, Trump saw his name as Mad Dog. He thought that sounded cool, and then accidentally hired someone with qualifications. Everyone else was hired to basically dismantle the department that they're supposed to lead. And that's true in this case as well, but he kind of aimed lower. He's casting people who he thinks look good on TV, will wear the right hat, get the right Botox, whatever they're doing, play the part. And then behind the scenes, that's where it matters. That's where you get this very insular network. It's people who have been with him for a very long time. You've got that with Lewandowski, I guess, going back at least over a decade. Kushner is a relative. I really would like to know what Roger Stone and Paul Manafort and Michael Flynn and others are up to. We know Bannon, is involved still. It doesn't matter if you get, indicted in Trump world. None of these things ever stick. Whatever government's in charge, whether it's Biden or Trump, will just let you fly. I do think the Epstein stuff poses a threat to all these people. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's a facet that frustrates me, because people constantly turn to, oh, well, we'll vote him out. We'll get him in the midterms. And, go ahead and vote in the midterms. That's fine. And if you have like a really good candidate, then that's great. You should support them. You can't vote out the mafia. You can vote and change people who will be better at standing up for the mafia. And you can do things like not vote the mafia into office, because we unfortunately have that as well. But you can't get out a shadow network that's refusing to even admit it really exists as such, and that's why when people, kind of treat Trump as this geopolitical genius who's calling all the shots, I'm like, he's not that. He's the guy on TV. And before that, he was the guy in the New York tabloids. And before that, he was the face of the Trump Organization and Trump Tower and, Celebrity Apprentice. And behind the scenes, even the properties that were sold on The Apprentice were mobbed up properties, through companies like Bayrock that were, investigated for massive corruption and fraud schemes. He was committing fraud on national television, and they just, they let him get away with it. And that's why he's very confident, is because he spent a very long life committing crime or at least illicit activity on a extremely regular basis, tutored by the king of streamlining organized crime, Roy Cohn, and has been successful. But yeah, it's that shadow network behind the scenes folks should look at. And also, just like one last name who I wonder, what's he doing now? Where are they now? Eric Prince, the mercenary. When we have all of these foreign operations going on abroad, I kind of want to know what happened with that. All of these folks were supposed to be brought before Congress in 2019. Nancy Pelosi killed that entire process. It started with Michael Cohen and it ended with Michael Cohen because, people were dodging subpoenas and whatnot. But they also just decided, we'll just vote him out. We'll just get a new president. It'll all magically go away, because clearly a great, powerful, billionaire-backed organized crime network will just give up. They're really known for that. So I have some questions about how that went down, but yeah, it's unfortunately what we're facing.
I'm so glad you mentioned Eric Prince. I used to crow about him, but even I have sort of focused on other stuff, and I forget that he's still out there.
Multiply, it's like having bed bugs or something. Like you just you're sleeping and getting eaten, and
it's hard to keep track of all the toxicity. I mean, it is real. Now, let me ask you specifically about the Epstein files and revelations. And, there have been so many redactions, and, Trump's name, even though it shows up a million times, there has been a dry cleaning of these Epstein files that's just it's so deliberate. And the revealing of victims' names accidentally, and then the redaction of those who are the perpetrators. It's it's happening in a way that does still have costs associated with it. You've seen, major players in the law, major players in government, overseas, all pay a price. But it still feels as though, and I know you've written extensively about this, we're just seeing a fraction of what is actually involved in the Epstein thing.
Yeah, I mean, one thing folks need to remember is during Trump's first term, for example, not a large number of people surrounding him were indicted. I mean, I think kind of everybody was. You had Manafort, Stone, Flynn, Michael Cohen, so forth. What happened to them? Like almost nobody served time. They all went out and got podcasts. They all became enormously wealthy because they committed crimes and then were able to invent themselves, and people forgot what they originally did and they just moved along. I think the same strategy is being used for the Epstein perpetrators, which is even worse because the crime they committed is worse. They were involved in child rape, trafficking. I think a lot of them were involved in espionage. So, they took their sweet time in the UK doing anything about Prince Andrew, who people knew was involved with this, for like over a decade easily. And then now, they made him give up his title. It's like, and then now they're finally saying that he's going to be arrested, but, wake me up when he's actually feeling any hardship from this, or having to make amends, or giving up other names of people involved, or doing anything that brings forth meaningful accountability. I mean, accountability to me is like, this operation is fully exposed. It ends. It can't happen again. The people involved in it are prosecuted. And, to be clear, I'm not a big, I like incarceration kind of person. I generally lean towards more of an abolitionist stance. Not for this, not for a child rape and trafficking network. Clearly, these are people who think they can do absolutely any sadistic act that they want, and they get off on doing the absolute worst things possible, and they need to be contained in some way. And I think also, well, why are they doing this? Why are there so many people who wanted to rape a child, so that therefore, when, if they are taped doing so, they can be blackmailed with it? Because that's the other facet. Like it all needs to come out, but not in the way that they're doing it. Because just like you said, it's selective redaction meant to punish the victims of this crime by exposing their personal details, making them relive their pain on a national level, having the whole country gossip about it. They're trying to convert it into a spectacle, into a tabloid story, into something that, we forget these are real human beings who are suffering then alone. And now they're suffering alone, but with everyone watching them, which I think is the worst feeling you could possibly have. And so my heart just, it just breaks for them. And it also breaks for whoever this is happening to now, because I definitely don't think that this ended with Epstein's alleged death in 2019. And there's been some, odd treatment of, Ghislaine Maxwell in prison, favorable treatment that implies that whoever truly is behind this thing, it has no, is not intimidated from any, horrific action at all.
Yeah. And I think the release of the victims' names also probably had a message associated with it, don't get too chirpy, because, this is just the beginning of what we can do to you.
Or to others, to other victims. I think especially more recent ones, a lot of the Epstein victims, they're my age, they're teens of the 90s and early 2000s who are now, adult women in their 30s and 40s. And, something happens when you kind of hit this age and you start I don't know, you have more ferocity. You want to fight back, in part because, a lot of us are moms and we want to protect our daughters. We want to educate our sons, and we want to make sure this doesn't happen to another generation. And I think that feeling, that determination will override fear. I think for some of the younger trafficked and abused women, I think that fear may be still so strong. And I think that's who they're trying to send that message to, because whoever was after them also are the people who are most recently involved in running this operation. So it's an intimidation tactic. It's saying, your most personal violations will be broadcast to the world in a way you cannot control, while you are not receiving any kind of meaningful protection from the people who did it to you, because they're still out there. They're still running around. It's not like there is a roundup. And again, this is, an interesting thing, because I do think the whole country, in terms of the citizenry of basically every country, is united on this, in disgust for this network. They're revolted by Epstein and Maxwell. It doesn't matter who you are. So it would be a tremendously popular move to round up all of these guys and make them go to court and make them have to, confess their crimes and explain them and apologize and face some kind of criminal repercussions. They're not doing that, even though it is a win-win if you want to win an election or win popularity. They just want power, and they don't care who they abuse to get it.
I mean, even Bannon and Trump have Epstein all over them like a bad smell, and they haven't really been confronted in any way. And Trump, this is sort of his superpower, as he says, a BS artist. He gets out in front of the narrative and says, I've been totally exonerated. I'm so glad it came out. Yeah, of course, it showed that I did nothing. And Bannon really hasn't been challenged on it either. I mean, it's a sort of, as you said, they've been given a pass. And lastly, on Andrew, he wasn't arrested for that which you talk about, which is revolting. He was arrested for the passage of information, of secret information, to in a way that violated British law. So again, the real price has yet to be paid, I guess would be the way to say it.
Yeah, it's frustrating. And, with Trump and his connection to the Epstein victims, that's been out for so long that the court documents are in a book that I wrote in 2020. They're hiding in plain sight. So the allegation that Trump raped a 13-year-old girl, that was something that went to court, and they were going to have a press conference about it shortly before the 2016 election. And it basically, not only wasn't it, anything happening in court, but the media ignored it for the next 10 years. And then suddenly you get this avalanche of information. You get all of these kind of their primary sources, but not quite, because they're redacted in such a way, and they're put out by people who are famously inaccurate, known for lies, known for propaganda. You can't really trust what you're seeing. And they also, I think, waited for AI, waited for algorithmic suppression, waited for social media networks to be owned by people who are their friends, in order, kind of knowing that this would get out at some point. I do think people should still keep trying. I've honestly been heartened to see how many people at least care that this happened and are, they feel for the victims. It's a hard topic to read about too. So I think there's, somewhat for those who aren't acting as voyeurs, for those who truly are looking at this with their hearts, I think it's a brave and it's a tough thing to do. So, just to keep those victims and what they went through in mind.
I mean, I'll say this, it's had a seismic effect on MAGA support. I mean, it's cut through, you know what I mean? Even his loyalists are shocked by a lot of the Epstein stuff. So it in a way, I'm encouraged by that. As you say, the crimes are so heinous that they're transcending the political, hyper partisanship of America right now.
Yeah, MAGA, or at least the QAnon faction of MAGA, they were always on this case. Quite honestly, when I had Hiding in Plain Sight come out and I had a lot of stuff about this, I heard from people from MAGA who were I'm not backing Trump anymore. I was going to go to the Capitol and now I'm not going to, because I didn't know that he was connected to the Epstein stuff. They knew the Epstein stuff, very frustrated that it was portrayed as a wild, baseless conspiracy theory. They got really sick of hearing that. I got sick of hearing that. I think, we're all united on that point. I was surprised that the Democrats did not pursue it. One, because it's a phenomenal, horrific crime. So you would think everyone would want to make it stop. But also, if you want to run against somebody, like you've got kind of the ultimate ammunition here, because there is universal loathing of this action, of this network. And then they didn't go after Trump's association. And I'm assuming it's because a lot of Democratic donors are in there. Bill Clinton is in there. This is something that spans all party lines. And I think there is sort of a gentleman's agreement, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, that's far too much of a euphemism, to
Right.
just be quiet. And that's something people don't understand about real high level conspiracies. They always think, people can't keep their mouths shut. They really can. I've studied this topic for over a decade, and there are things I didn't know that were in those emails, things I wish honestly I had never learned, because they're so horrific. But there are still, and the same was said by Julie K. Brown, who was the person at the Miami Herald who broke the case open, brought it back into the limelight in 2018. She was also surprised by some of the things in there. So this is like a very dark path. But yeah, I think most people in America are against mass child abuse, rape, and trafficking, including those who voted for Trump. They don't want that. Unfortunately, the people who seem fine with it are the ones running our governments, businesses, corporations, and powerful institutions. And so that's it's a really frightening position for us to be in.
And the other side that sort of coexists with the child trafficking is the high finance games that are being played here. And there's a lot of illegality there. And some of that's come out in the Epstein files, with Lutnick being called out in writing. You see it, illegal. Lutnick's illegal investment and so you end up with this weird sloshing together of, and you write about this too, of international high finance, about it's really a criminal enterprise that's coexisting with this disgusting underworld of sex trafficking.
Yeah, I mean, with Lutnick, he should have been examined from the get-go. Like, this is literally Epstein's next-door neighbor and friend. They lived at 9 and 11 71st Street. And, Lutnick at that point was most famous for being late to work on 9/11. But, then went on to be involved in a lot of, illicit activity in the world of finance. He was backing Trump's campaign. This is somebody who should have been under intense scrutiny during his confirmation hearings. And quite clearly, he should not have been in there. The number of people close to Epstein that filled both Trump administrations as well as the Biden administration, and also parts of the Obama administration, it's alarming, and I think also some pop up in George W. Bush's as well. Like, it really is this little clique. I think they've got secrets that go beyond just the Epstein network, and they travel into international affairs. I think it would be good to reevaluate certain things, like the 2008 financial crash, reevaluate 9/11. I know everybody is like, we can never do that. I think it's absolutely essential to do that, and kind of look at the people involved, and where are they now? What was Rudy Giuliani really after? What kind of guy was he? Was he really America's mayor, or did he turn into an organized crime affiliate, committing illegal acts under Donald Trump's auspices during the first term? Like, it's good to kind of track these long career arcs and how they intersect with major movements in time. I'm not saying everything was pre-planned and pre-plotted. People react to things as they happen, but a lot of people who were portrayed as good or as victims, I think we're closer to the center of this criminal conspiracy, and that is what this is. Epstein and Maxwell is a criminal conspiracy, than they were portrayed publicly at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting if you look at people who sold their souls now, in your judgment.